All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel, and we take a look at great theories of everything, kind of dice them up, try to examine them, figure out the best way to use these things in our lives. In our quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, our awakening to 5D consciousness, our formation of a holistic worldview, and we usually look at things that are pretty obscure and that you might not have ever heard of before, or maybe you just haven't heard of them in kind of the context that they want to be presented in. Anyway, today is our 12th episode of going over the book called It's After the End of the World, Don't You Know That Yet? And this is a history of three groups of jazz musicians in Chicago, two in New York, two in Chicago, one in New York, kind of, sort of. And they kind of went rogue on the jazz establishment and started playing music that they felt in their heart, and had to deal with a whole lot of flack. And so we are in chapter 3 of this right now. We're looking at the New York scene, and we were in a section about Ornette Coleman, and saxophonist primarily. And we just went through passages where he's being dressed down by critics, especially those from Downbeat magazine, and we could probably take over from there. Coleman was one of the few jazz-free musicians who had the time to contemplate, justify, and even take advantage of his negative publicity, and he felt the need to explain his position. His motive was not to offend the public, but to express something new to them. In his own defense, Coleman wrote a letter to Downbeat in 1962, stressing the fact that modern jazz was based upon market forces and hierarchies. For him, the material, quote, the material that comprised jazz in its current state was the problem. It was built upon the social concept of classes in jazz: those who created it, those who listened to it, and those who profited from it. Okay, this section is on Cecil Taylor and Albert Ayler. Coleman was undaunted and stood up to the establishment because of the deep grounding of his convictions. The same was true of Cecil Taylor. By the time Taylor came on the New York scene in the mid-1950s, he had graduated from the New England Conservatory of Music, but he could also improvise for hours at the piano without repeating cliches. Taylor's daunting presence at sessions showed when virtuoso musicians left for fear they would not be able to get together with him. As one of his few collaborators related, quote, "The Cats are like runners away. They didn't have enough faith in themselves to believe they could handle as much music as Cecil plays." End quote. The musicians were afraid to make mistakes, to expose their weaknesses by going out there with Cecil Taylor. Taylor's own conservatory education lent legitimacy to his radicalism, for it showed a conscientious objection to his reliance upon a well-understood, comfortable background in composed music in favor of a journey into the unknown. Despite the fact that he was trained in classical music, Cecil Taylor felt that such a musical education, which he called instruction in technique, was superficial. Quote, anyone having the desire and the economic means to subsidize that desire can master technique, he said. Taylor believed that conservatories and other institutions that teach composed music could be beneficial in the development of a musician. Once one was able to master technique, however, it was necessary to go after, quote, go after feelings. For Taylor, techniques were only devices to get the desired feelings out of the instrument. He did not want to play the notes of the piano. He wanted to project his most inner nature through the piano. He did not need to have a pre-arranged piece in order to express himself. He wanted to express his own internal conception of reality directly through an instrument he really knew. For Taylor, playing free was a process of learning to go after these feelings. Taylor practiced his craft with only a few others from 1954 to 1960 in the small clubs of the Lower East Side and Harlem. As a maverick, Taylor's attitude won the hostility of the jazz establishment. The club context imposed the most immediate barriers on Taylor's expression. In many of these clubs, the conditions included untuned pianos, pianos with missing keys, cramped space on the bandstand, the continuous sound of a cash register, and no dressing room. The musicians often had to roam the streets when they were not performing. Club owners did not take kindly to Taylor's protests over these conditions, but mostly his unpopularity among club owners was due to the fact that they only want to sell drinks. But as one follower attested, quote, when Cecil's playing, people are likely to tell the waiter to shut up and be still. Taylor was attempting to bring a ritual element of the higher forces into even the most secular of surroundings, and this was particularly true once Taylor found saxophonist Albert Ayler. Ayler was one of the few musicians who would even play with Taylor. He came to New York by way of Cleveland, having also played in a military band in Orléans, France. His rise in many ways represents the apogee of the jazz free ethic in New York. In spite of hostile opposition, he believed, quote, a man who's creating doesn't have time to hate. Ayler declared that, quote, the music is good for the mind. It frees the mind. If you just listen, you find out more about yourself. And pleaded, we're asking the whole world to listen and understand. We're all together, everybody, and there has to be peace. That's what we're saying. Like Taylor, Ayler understood that it was necessary to invoke a ritual atmosphere in order to get the audience to listen and understand. Music's power to communicate spiritual unity in ritual was akin to a process of hypnosis, quote, hypnosis. For Ayler, hypnosis was a fitting word, for it implied complicity. One had to be willing to be hypnotized. Ayler believed that the best way he could hypnotize with his music was through a process of physical purification for himself and for the audience. Quote, you have to purify and crystallize your sound in order to hypnotize, he claimed. Taylor was also interested in trance, which led to a magical lifting of people's spirits. While such grand notions of the music's higher potential may have been difficult for secular jazz audiences to comprehend, it was clear that Ayler, Taylor, and many others saw their mission as healing themselves and other people through a process of contacting with higher centers of consciousness and communicating them to audiences. In reality, at least some of these expectations were met. One writer attended a concert in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, and according to him, the, quote, unprepared crowd was initially taken by surprise by Ayler's music, and they responded with boos. But according to that witness, Quote, the boos quickly changed to screams of ecstasy. Some even wept. At least on that occasion, Eiler's purpose was partially fulfilled. Another time in Germany, when Eiler was performing with Taylor and drummer Sonny Murray at a club, the music became too free of jazz, too out there for one of the bartenders. He started violently throwing glasses off the bar, yelling in German, "Stop the music! Stop the music!" Years later, Eiler returned to that same venue and was greeted amicably by the bartender, who declared himself a changed man and testified that the music that day had saved him. Even if such stories are fabricated, their retelling tends to show the musician's aspirations to save listeners through a raising of the spirit. Others, particularly the brass of the music industry, were less convinced. Rather than seeing Eiler's and Taylor's transformations as a matter of conviction, the establishment saw it as a threat. Section 7 is called Jazz-Free in Repetition. Through records by Coleman, Taylor, Eiler, and the media's reactions, the battle lines in New York were drawn for the latest schism in jazz. But aside from the characterizations of critics who were attracted to controversy, the ambivalence among musicians in the early years of the movement demonstrates that these battle lines were more inscribed than real. Established musicians heard the music differently from Eiler and Taylor, but they took it very seriously. Some liked it more than others, but Taylor, Eiler, and especially Coleman's records were influential and carefully considered by many contemporary musicians. Rather than a hostile split between musicians, the jazz-free ideal and the specter of playing out in public often generated ambivalence and divisions within individual musicians. As Rodano points out, before 1965, there was less of a split and more of a semi-permeable membrane between the two communities of musicians. One group was ambivalent while one was more committed to the new music. The former group was often recorded on Alfred Lyon's Blue Note label, the latter on Bernard Stolman's ESP label. Stolman was a lawyer who was associated with jazz because he had worked on the estates of the deceased musicians Charlie Parker and Billie Holiday. He became involved in the record business because about 1960 he started to produce instructional albums of Esperanto, the proposed universal language. One day in late 1963, he went to a session and saw Albert Eiler for the first time, and he was so taken that after the session, he asked Eiler if he wanted to become his first recording artist. Drummer Sonny Murray and the white bassist Gary Peacock accompanied Eiler to record Spiritual Unity for ESP, and very quickly Stolman adjusted his ideas regarding a universal language. In October 1964, many musicians in the movement participated in a musical event, the October Revolution, at the Cellar Cafe. The 6-night affair was organized by trumpeter-composer Bill Dixon. In the packed house of 65 each night was Stolman, and later he invited all participants to record with ESP. Bernard Stolman decided to release 10 LPs simultaneously in 1965, including Spiritual Unity, and many more over the next 10 years. ESP was a conscious attempt to defer to the musicians, to stay away from the abusive roles of repetition throughout the record industry. According to Stolman, the philosophy behind ESP was to let the artist have the freedom to choose their own sidemen, repertoire, studio, and engineer. Essentially, they produced their own albums. They also had the authority to choose their own cover artwork or photograph, and to write liner notes if they wished. The role of ESP disc was to finance the production and to release and promote the album. The phrase, "the artists alone decide," arose from this reality. For a short time, this made Stallman a popular man in the movement, but things soon turned sour when these records did not make money. As Wilmer explains, quote, "None of the artists were actually paid other than a minute advance against royalties, and some did not even get this. They signed contracts to this effect, but naturally enough, they anticipated a speedy return in royalties. When this money was not rapidly forthcoming, there were a whole lot of angry musicians in New York." The musicians, however, were taking a lot of things for granted. As Sun Ra, who played at the October Revolution and even recorded 2 of the early LPs for ESP, remarked in Stallman's defense, quote, "Well, he's the only one who records the music," end quote. There was no one else who was willing to take the financial risk. Moreover, Stallman's contract was actually favorable to the musicians compared with the standard music contract. Saxophonist Noah Howard admitted, quote, "In a sense, I could say he manipulated me because he was offering me something knowing that I didn't know what I was being offered. But he gave me a contract when nobody else in America would have dreamed of doing so. He gave me a contract and I signed it. I can read. It wasn't what a musician should get for doing a record album, but he didn't make any pretensions otherwise." Stallman claimed that he didn't make any money off the 1965 ESPs either. The musicians were certainly anxious for a paycheck, but in hindsight, they might have been happy to get the music documented at all. As in other instances of repetition, the agent of the record company, even if he had good motives, ended up alienating himself from the musicians by giving them the shaft. No one was directly at fault. It was just the way that repetition within the recording industry had been organized historically. Just as an aside here, I don't know, I was listening to a radio program or something, and Bernard Stallman, this record ESP disc owner, he died, maybe it was 10 years ago or 15, I don't know how long ago it was, but they were doing something about him on the radio, and they referred to a story, and it was that Yoko Ono and John Lennon showed up at some party, and apparently Bernard Stallman was there, and he knew Yoko Ono for some reason. I don't know if he ever recorded her or what, but I think he did, maybe on one of those ESPs in the late 60s. But so Yoko Ono and John Lennon went over to Bernard Stallman, and Yoko Ono introduced herself, or introduced John to Stallman, and he said, "Oh yeah, well he's the guy who runs ESP Disc." And John said, "Oh yeah, Paul has those Sun Ras." So he's saying that Paul McCartney had bought some of those early 1965 Sun Ra albums that came out on ESP, and was listening to them. I mean, this party occurred much later, but John Lennon at least knew that McCartney was influenced by those early Sun Ras. So even though here we're talking about in the movement that, they didn't make any money off those ESPs, but people were listening. So people who were creative were listening. Okay, so back to the text. After the success of the October Revolution, Bill Dixon approached many of the musicians to set up an organization for protecting the music, the Jazz Composers Guild. The group was interracial, and according to Wilmer, this jazz-free group planned to withhold their labor and develop self-respect among the musicians. They planned to turn down work unless it was considered that accepting it would be advantageous to the guild as a whole. They put on a series of concerts in December and made plans to set up other programs that would protect the musicians. Before long, however, guild member Archie Shepp, having children to support, seized the opportunity to record for the Impulse label without the consent of the rest of the guild. Shepp pleaded his case, but the guild members were not forgiving. Dissension reigned, and even founder Bill Dixon quit. Okay, this section is called John Coltrane. The musicians who recorded for ESP Disc tended to be those militants who were thoroughly committed to the new music, but there were just as many who were ambivalent, still clinging to the old ways. Some of these musicians were also recorded on ABC Impulse, which is most well known for recording more than a dozen albums from saxophonist John Coltrane, who was a symbol of jazz-free ambivalence. During the last 2 years of Coltrane's life, 1965 to 67, however, deep feelings of ambivalence gave way to liberation. By the time John Coltrane employed 7 members of the jazz-free movement for his album Ascension, 1965, dozens of musicians became convinced that they could play free and even get paid for it. Now, that if you were listening in the introduction, Ascension, that album there is in the first chapter it explains that Ascension was the kind of cognitive dissonance that was introduced in the first chapter, where the music was expected to be something and it wasn't. And, it was like, what is this? And this is ridiculous, because it was such a big departure from a lot of Coltrane's earlier music from 5 years before that or whatever. Through the example of Coltrane, musicians were freed from their feelings of ambivalence. After Coltrane's premature death, however, liberation often gave way to license under the oppositional black re-representation of the music into black nationalism. John Coltrane's life was the quintessential example of a jazz-free musician overcoming ambivalence. And like the case of Alan Tinney 25 years earlier, Coltrane's case also sheds light on the structure of oppositional representation through which violence can result from the actions of even those with heroic intentions. Through his music and his actions, John Coltrane has become a symbol of the spiritual leader in jazz. His popularity, however, might have had debilitating long-term effects on the health of the jazz-free music, because his music and message have been misrepresented. A sketch of his career will show how this could occur. Train had gained acclaim as a bebop musician in the 1950s, which grew to fame as he formed his own group in 1959. Throughout the early 1960s, he was a controversial leading figure in the jazz world. Every Coltrane album, it seemed, evidenced a new breakthrough, stretching the limits of jazz. His sheets of sound approach to improvising was the newest thing in bebop, with the critics of downbeat in 1959. His revival of the soprano saxophone, his big band music in 1961, and his use of Indian music were all pioneering contributions. Before 1957, I'm sorry. I think we're just going to stop right there. There's somebody at the door and they're delivering something. I have to get it, and we only have a couple more minutes. So we'll stop there, and we will return and talk about John Coltrane tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in today, and have a beautiful day.